So let me pass over to Mr. Rene now, and he will share his thoughts on that.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. And welcome to this afternoon session. So I hope you didn't eat too much, so you can still pay attention to what I'm presenting. So I'm actually not only talking about fisheries and the fishery and seafood sector, but in the overview I also share some insights on the agriculture section. So how are these value chains actually structured? There are actually three main sectors where food is produced. It's the classical agriculture, and this is basically the land-based production system, right? And there is the water-based production system, which is divided into the wild capture sector. That's actually the only industry left today where we are still hunters and not farmers. And then the more modern version, which is the aquaculture sector, where actually fish and seafood is farmed in a kind of cultivation system. So basically I try to structure the thing. These three sectors have actually all very similar supply and value chains. So what I try to do here is, the value chain goes from left to right. And basically you have production in the country of origins, and you tend to have, of course, the import, distribution, final consumer marketing in the country of destination, which can be national or international markets. Basically, the whole thing starts with the raw material production. This is the farming and fishing, of course, and then it goes through different stages of processing. Some countries have a kind of a strong position in higher value processing. Others are rather just focusing on commodity processing and are exporting raw materials. This actually depends on the product and the local site conditions of these countries. And then finally, the value and supply chain goes on. Products are then imported in different forms. There is further manufacturing in many cases, until you actually have the final consumer product, which is then ready to go on the market on a retail food service level. And the kind of a specific market for the farmed raw materials is the whole feed industry, which is actually then again the raw material for the farming. So it's actually kind of a cycle. So for the agri and aquaculture, the feed is then actually again used in the farming process. So this is another value chain. If we look at the three different sectors shortly, this is the overview for the agriculture sector. And we look at the different stages in the supply chain. There is always actually ahead of the farming industry, there is a kind of a local or international input industry that is providing all the inputs for the farming. So that's actually where the value chain starts. So this is in the form of agriculture. We're mainly talking about the feed. That's for all the animal rearing. Then all the inputs required in terms of energy and nutrition. This is basically fertilizer and fuel. All the agri-chemicals, more or less, depending on the farming method. The whole seed and breeding, this is more like a scientific technology thing, because there you can actually influence a lot of how successfully you farm. And the whole technology, machinery, equipment, and so on. So this is usually a local industry, or it can also be actually an industry that is outside the country, where things are farmed and then things are imported. And then, then it goes through the farming, and as I said, then you have various models. That's the same for aquaculture and fisheries. Here in the agriculture example, you have processing of raw materials. This can be actually then go more on a commodity market in the form, for example, of corn and grain and soy. This is no further processing. Or you have some pre-manufacturing, for example, rice mills that are milling the rice, and then you export the rice, but it's still a kind of a raw material. Or you have actually countries where the final consumer product is already manufactured in the country of origin. That's, for example, a canned tuna or a kind of a processed value-added consumer ready-to-eat product. And then, basically the thing goes on the international market. So these four sections are only reflecting the local supply and value chain in the country of origin. From there it goes actually then to the export country. So that's how the structure looks like. In aquaculture it's quite similar because it's also a cultivation industry where things are farmed. Here we have a little bit slightly different inputs, but quite similar to the farming on land. We need feed. You have hatchery breeding technology for the tuna, small little fish and shrimp, machinery, equipment, technology. Then the farming actually takes place in three different environments. You have aquaculture, which is a marine farmed, basically ocean-based or onshore water-based, lakes and rivers, or you actually have land-based systems that compete with the agriculture for land and soil and water. So you have three different kinds of sectors for the production. And then it goes on, the same as for the basically agriculture products. And also here it really depends how strong a country can get a grip on the manufacturing and the final manufacturing, because here it's where most of the value is actually created. And then for the fishery, this is quite a specific industry because it's the only industry left where we are still like hunting for wild animals. So here it's of course a little bit different inputs. You need vessels, technology, gear, fuel, machinery, equipment, technology. And then you have two sectors. You have the marine sector and the freshwater sector. And these two sectors are quite different in management and policy because it's different environments. And then it goes, again, the same actually as the aquaculture products. There is no difference between seafood processing from fisheries or seafood processing from farming. It's actually the same. Just the origin that is different. So this is the overview of what is happening in terms of the supply chain in the countries of origin where things are actually produced. There would actually be a fourth sector here under this agriculture, agri-food sector, that is the forestry. That's actually also kind of a sector where you still grow natural resources that are renewable, but I actually left out the forestry here. But the forestry is very similar to agriculture and fisheries. So it's a little bit a mix between. If you look now at the local supply chain in the countries where things are produced, what I try to do here is basically to outline the framework and important topics that should actually be subject to policy for actually development of this industry and also to allow the participation of the industry in local or international supply and value chains. So you see here again the four different supply chain elements, and basically the policy or the topics and issues that should be subject to policy or where policy allows better participation are basically listed here. And they're quite different between the different supply chain elements. The input, this is now for agriculture, for fisheries and aquaculture, that's the same. So basically I did not differentiate anymore. This is just generally for agri and seafood products. And what I want to outline here is for the input industry, where actually the inputs are produced or delivered to the production industry, the farming and fishery, is actually, of course, here we have a strong technology and infrastructure component. For example, you know, if you want to build a strong aquaculture industry, you need a strong feed industry. If there's no feed, there is no feed to feed fish. So basically, a lot of countries are still struggling with aquaculture because simply they don't have a feed industry. And they need to import the feed, which is usually too expensive to stay competitive. So basically, in this input field, you have a variety of topics where also research, technology, science, you know, these are relevant topics to actually stay competitive and to actually create, you know, a framework or conditions that the local industry can actually compete in the market with other value and supply chains. And then, of course, all the usual things, you know, energy is very important, the availability of skilled labor, and also access to finance and capital. That's for the input industry. And then what I want to outline here is, you know, the conditions and the framework that they actually should be subject to policy is, what we need to be aware is that fisheries, farming, aquaculture, these are all three industries that fully depend on natural resources, right? And they depend on natural resources not just for one time, but for always, right? Because otherwise, if the natural resources, because it's renewable, you know, things are growing, and it's actually living matter. So all the policy, you know, if countries that are strong in the production sector, and if they want to keep strong in the production sector, they actually need to address all these issues of sustainability, which is actually quite straightforward and logic. Because, you know, if soil productivity goes down and fertilizer costs are increasing because the soil is not managed properly, at the end there is no more product. And with no product, there is no supply chain. The same is for fisheries. If fisheries are badly managed, there is no more fish. And basically the supply chain is dead. And the same is for farming. So basically all these three sectors, there are a lot of policy issues that actually should address all these topics here that allow the local production industry to, you know, to continuous the production, because otherwise there is simply no production anymore. And there are actually a lot of examples, specifically in the seafood industry, but also in the agriculture sector, where countries have had a very strong position in, you know, producing raw materials, but due to either missing policy or not adequate policy or kind of failing policy, the whole production simply broke down and the industry was finished. And this still happens in many countries today. So for example, in the shrimp farming industry, where Asia is the world leader in shrimp farming, still a lot of countries are, you know, basically have huge problems in the policy sector, that the policy is not addressing the biosecurity risks. And the shrimp farming sector is like, it goes up and down, you know, when the shrimp are happy and there's no disease, everybody's happy, it makes money. But, you know, things are very sensitive, and if biosecurity or climate water conditions are not adequately reflected in the policy, the whole sector dies. So for example, today in Thailand is the world shrimp exporter #1, or has been. There was a big disease 2 years ago, and the whole shrimp industry, you know, went 80% down production, and 50% of the Thai processing industry are out of business. There's no more shrimp, and the other 50% are only surviving because they can import raw material from India and Indonesia, which they are selling then as Thai shrimp, but it's actually shrimp from India and Indonesia. So in all these sectors, I think a strong focus must be on these conditions up here, because if these conditions are not met, there is actually no long-term supply chain you can get access to. And another important issue in my view is, beside, you know, if this is about to promote local production and to allow in supply chains. What is also important, of course, is all the livelihoods and community aspects, because usually, specifically in Asia, there's a lot of small-scale farming. It's not actually large-scale industrial farming as you have it in South America or North America or partly in Europe and Australia. But actually here in Asia, it's all about small-scale families, small-scale farming, and small-scale fishing usually. So it's quite specific. And then, you know, what I'm outlining here for the processing and manufacturing, if you have the raw materials from the fishery sector and the farming, of course then here, you know, infrastructure, investments in proper infrastructure or the availability of infrastructure, all the policies around food safety, quality, traceability, you know, food laws are then actually of most important. If in a country there is no existing effective food safety framework, basically this country cannot export. So there is no market there. And specifically in the case of seafood, which is a highly perishable, you know, protein which goes bad very quickly, and in a climate with hot air and high temperatures, this is very tricky. So this is actually quite a complex issue that must be properly addressed, otherwise there is no market access for the products. And then finally for the export and trade, it's mainly about the finance, capital, you know, market access. It's about the trade regulations, trade agreements. There is actually a lot of subsidies in this sector, which is somehow, you know, creating situations where the costs are not real. You know, basically, Asian producers are competing with US and European producers that are subsidized. Like our farmers in Europe, they get a lot of money to put their products on the market, and your farmers basically not. So there are problems in this area, which make a lot of products, for example, from small-scale farmers, not competitive. That's more like a political issue. And what I want to outline here is, you know, beside policies, there is an increasing number of certifications that are most relevant to access markets. So basically there is the official national policy and laws and regulation, or international agreements and whatever, but basically for a lot of products and for a lot of markets, what finally counts are food safety certifications, sustainability certifications, social certifications. You know, the buyers and the big retailers and the market is increasingly asking for a kind of third-party, independent, verified situations, specifically for products that are manufactured in countries where the regulation and enforcement is not the best. So this is actually quite an important area. So I hope this helps to somehow have an overview of where policy should actually focus in this sector. In my second part, I'm sharing now with you some, you know, personal and practical insights into the industry. As you heard myself, I have a background in fisheries and aquaculture, but also we are running different seafood processing companies in Asia, in the Maldives, in India, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and in the Philippines. And basically, this is an example about our work in the Philippines, where we are working with small-scale fisheries. As I said, you know, small-scale fisheries and same small-scale farmers, they are specifically somehow challenged in going on global markets because, you know, there's a huge amount of complexity and they are struggling with all these regulations and conditions. But basically, they often do a much better job than the industrial component, talking about the sustainability. So the reason why we are in the Philippines, that's just a little background. We're working with the yellowfin tuna fisheries. The Philippines have actually quite a big artisanal fishery sector. That's the same also for Indonesia, for the Maldives, for example. And these small-scale fisheries, they actually do a much, much better job in catching the fish because they are selectively catching the fish. There's no bycatch, so they catch the tuna and nothing else. And a lot of, for example, industrial fleets are catching, sharks, dolphins, turtles, birds, and everything. And, but still, the products from the industrial fleet is often landed in the same harbor as the product from the small-scale fisheries. And then basically things are mixed up, and they go on the market with no identity, So basically the consumer doesn't know if this tuna is now from a nicely selective caught or from a big industrial vessel with all the problems associated. So the reason why we work with these guys is they catch the tuna very selectively. But on the other side, if you look at the conditions, there is, it's maybe 40 degrees here, so basically they go out for 2 days. They need to take ice, temperature very hot. They maybe bring 2 tunas back home for one vessel. And we struggle with a lot of food safety, quality, traceability, and so on issues because the product is designed for the local market in Manila and for European, US, and Japanese markets. And these markets are asking for high quality food safety regulations. They are asking for non-IUU regulations, which is illegal, unregulated fishing. So all these markets, they need fish which is subject to regulated, not illegal fishery. But all these countries worldwide, except maybe 3 countries, are actually having a lot of problems with regulating their fisheries. Everybody basically, except maybe Alaska and Norway. But otherwise, fisheries are very, very difficult to manage, specifically with migratory species, because these tuna, they are moving around everywhere and nobody really knows where they are. So there are a lot of challenges and also policy challenges we need to address in the Philippines. We are working with the local fishery ministry and with the local authorities and actually help them to implement existing policies. So basically there are policies, for example, in the Philippines or in Indonesia. There is a policy, for example, to register vessels. That's one important component to actually move an illegal fishery into the legal state is you need to register the vessel because nobody knows how many vessels are there. So there must be a vessel registration scheme. There is a legal, there are ordinances, laws in place, but basically they are not implemented because nobody knows how to implement it with 50,000 vessels and all these small-scale fishermen. So there are a lot of issues we are working on in Indonesia and the Philippines on these policy issues here. And what we developed is an initiative. This is now an example, a private initiative that actually helps local governments, local authorities to get a grip on global market by making their fisheries, by improving their small-scale fisheries. So this is this Artismar initiative. That's a program we have developed over the past 5 years. And Artismar actually offers the fishery a framework, a step-by-step framework to help small-scale fishermen access global markets by actually addressing all these challenges and complexities behind. That's what we do in the Philippines. And the program is specifically outlining or using the high catch selectivity as a key property of products from small-scale fisheries, and then also this high catch selectivity is specifically marketed on the market. If you look, the economic background of our focus, why we are working with small-scale fisheries and why retail clients from us are asking us to do it is actually this one here. You see the big difference, the global fisheries are divided between small-scale and industrial fisheries, but if you look at the socio-economic value of small-scale fisheries, it's a huge difference. There are like you know, there are 9 times more fishermen in the small-scale sector, and there are roughly, well, 20 times more livelihoods affected or, you know, benefited from the sector. But if you look at what is happening is a lot of policy or a lot of investment actually go here and not necessarily here. Of course, here, you know, everybody is also a little bit hiding behind complexity because it's very difficult. But I think there must be a much stronger focus on these realities. That's what we're trying to do. So we're working in the Philippines and Indonesia. This is an example of the Maldives. This is a Poland line skipjack fishery. So it's like a single hook thing where you have one hook, the bamboo pole, and you catch one tuna. And in the Maldives, it's a good example of they have a, similar to the Pacific island, you know, they are where the tuna is, you know, they are out in the ocean, but they basically have a little piece of land and a huge area of productive marine surface. And they catch a lot of tuna. So the fishery is quite actually very well developed, but they are struggling with keeping the value in the country because there is no processing sector. Because there is no processing sector, because there is a very high energy cost. They have nothing, you know, if they want to install a tuna cannery, you need to bring in everything. You know, they have no concrete, they have no stones, they have no steel. So basically the whole thing must come into the Maldives from outside. And this is why most of the tuna from the Maldives is frozen in the Maldives with fuel, like fuel energy based, and it goes to Bangkok for processing. So that's the reality. And this reality, for example, the tuna fisheries is in many, many cases, you know, where you have smaller countries or nations that have quite nicely developed fisheries, but for them it's very difficult to get out of this situation where they are just a raw material provider and to get actually more into more interesting industries like value-added processing, final consumer manufacturing. So just specifically, in my view, this is an overview where I try to put together just as a case example, what kind of challenges and constraints there are if small-scale fisheries want to, you know, get a grip on global markets. And not only get a grip on global markets in terms of, you know, supplying the raw material, but also getting a grip on the value. So basically bringing more value to the fishery and not to other sectors. And in the fishery sector, there is clearly a huge amount of focus required on the sustainability topics. That's maybe less of your concern where you are working because you are more in the trade and investment policy. But as I said, you know, without a sustainable fishery, there is simply no fish and there is no value. And so this is probably the most important and still actually an area that needs much, much more attention than today, because today simply roughly 50% of the marine resources are wasted. So if basically today, you know, the global catch is maybe 80 million tons of fish, but if all these fisheries would be sustainably managed, the catch would be roughly 120 to 130 million tons. So basically we have a system out there in the ocean which is highly productive and it would be sustainable and renewable, but we're managing it completely wrong. And the catch is only 80 million instead of 120 million. It could actually feed much more people. And another thing, for example, talking about, you know, post-harvest losses, that's another policy issue. Today, 30% of the landed catch is wasted due to quality problems, post-harvest losses, you know, fish, there's no ice, there's bad conditions, and basically so we're also quite bad there. We take out, but we can actually not process it, or we don't bring it really to the consumer. So there are a lot of issues here, and that, in my view, need to be better addressed. And then the third one, the food safety and quality, which is very important for seafood because it's a highly perishable commodity. There still needs to be a lot of policy work in a lot of countries, including Europe and US and Australia, on these issues in order to make seafood even more safe and to create less wastage. So this is basically these are the areas and topics where I see policy really matters in order to allow fishermen to get a grip on the supply and value chain. What we do in this is now going back to our fishery improvement initiative working with small-scale fisheries. What we do in the Philippines, in the Maldives and Indonesia, where we are working, is we are basically working in 3 areas, right? We're focusing on the economic aspects, on the ecological aspects, and on the social aspects with these small-scale fishermen. And in the middle, we are working with the Philippine authorities on the management and regulation. And this is where basically the policy comes into place in order to allow non-IUU licensing, vessel, catch documentation. For example, these 3 elements are just, without this, you can actually not sell it on the global market. Because then you actually have illegally produced seafood, and all trade regulations are actually asking for non-IUU seafood, which is non-IUU means illegal, undocumented, unregulated fishery. So these are quite complex issues that need to be improved in order to allow that seafood products can actually then enter global markets. So as the conclusions from my side and from my experience, one, as I said, all these 3 sectors, it's always important to keep in mind that actually we talk about natural resources in this case, and natural resources that are not just for once, but should actually be forever. And so policy, in my view, must have a very strong focus on these sustainability issues. And it's not just about the consumer product for fun, it's about food, it's for living. So it's also a very serious issue. When we want to feed a growing world population, we need to change our system, how we produce food. And for example, we can no longer waste food, right? It's simply not possible. And what I also want to outline is that the people that are at the beginning, at the start of the supply chain, are also in this sector mostly the most vulnerable people. So basically, of course, they do a hard job, but a farmer, a rice farmer, a fisherman, they do a lot of work. But at the end of the day, if you look at the value chain, usually what they get is actually quite minimum. So we should also try to get a focus on how we can improve income and value for the primary producers, which are, in the case of Asia, actually usually small-scale producers. And there is definitely a market case for this. A lot of retailers, at least in Europe, North America, they are specifically interested in these products. So there is a business case, there is an investment case into this if it's properly addressed. So I think this is it. Thanks for your attention. I hope maybe my presentation was a little bit outside your usual working ground, but this is what I was asked to present out of our experience working in this sector. So
thank you, Rene. And normally in